Hello ladies, Mr. Heath here with a revision PowerPoint and screencast for the social influences test that's coming up very soon. Now look, this PowerPoint / screencast is not really intended to be everything, but it's going to be a good general overview. Please check the checklist. If you look at the wiki, it's right up there, you can't miss it. Not to mention there's a whole bunch of other revision activities, solutions to the student activity manual. There's a lot that we haven't actually done in class but are still kind of relevant at the same time, so they're good revision as well. There's the practice quiz I showed you in class the other day. There's practice tests. There's a flowchart there that Mr. New has put up. There's a specific revision document. There's definitions. There's podcasts. There's lots of stuff. Okay, all the solutions for the flowcharts. I highly recommend you do the flowcharts in case you haven't already. Lots of stuff to do. Lots of stuff you can do. Do it wisely, yeah? But I'll take you through a few things nice and quickly. Very kind of fast-paced, gentle touch on most things, just to kind of prompt you in the right direction, okay? So, first of all, test structure. There's going to be 3 sections to this particular test. The first section, Section A, will have about 25 multiple choice questions, so about 25 marks in total therefore. Section B will consist of short answer questions. There might be kind of 5 to 8 of those, something like that, worth about 25 marks overall. Section C will be a research methods extended question, so not quite like the extended response that you've done already, but not too dissimilar at the same time. It'll be focused on those seminal studies, Zimbardo, Milgram, Ash, maybe one of them, maybe 2 of them, maybe all 3 of them, something around that sort of area. It will look at research methods, so you do have to know, as always, your aims, hypotheses, IVs, DVs, results, possible conclusions, all that sort of stuff. We expect you to know all of that to do with those 3 studies, and you always need to be continuing to revise, putting together hypotheses, putting together IVs, DVs, identifying them, and so forth. So, okay, let's go right back to the very start of this particular unit. Social influences. We're talking here about the effects of the presence or the actions of others, whether they're real things or whether they're actually imagined, on how we think, feel, and behave. Okay, so everything that we talk about after here and everything that we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks centers on this definition in essence. Okay, this is what we're looking at. So let's go to groups very quickly. Groups have to have all 4 of these elements to be considered a group. Okay, so they've got to have 2 or more people. The individuals within this group have to interact with each other over a period of time. It can't just be a hi-bye, that's it. Okay. They also have to be able to influence each other. And when I say influence each other, I don't mean in the sense of I say hi, you say hi. That's a very superficial kind of influence. Something a little bit more overarching in terms of, well, we're all getting into a cab and we're all going to the airport. Okay. Now, within the group, if we decide actually we want to go to the train station, not the airport, that'd be the sort of influence we're talking about. Because it's some sort of influence that changes thoughts or feelings or behaviors. And finally, have to have a common purpose. So in that taxi example, we have to all be going to the airport, or we have to all want to win the netball match for our team, or we have to all want to score 50 on our psychology 3-4 exam at the end of year 12. Okay, all those factors have to be there to be a group. So status and power, which is the first of the little ones we kind of looked at, must remember the difference between the two. Okay, so status is the importance of an individual's position in the group as perceived by the other members of the group. Okay, in essence, when we're talking about status, it's completely irrelevant as to what the individual themselves thinks. Okay, but it's everyone else in the group who's around them. It's what they think that matters. So if everyone else in the group thinks that you have high status and are in control of everything, then you're, in essence, you have that status and you're in that position. Whether or not you use that, the power that that status will give you, is up to you, but the perception of the others gives you that status. Power, on the other hand, refers to our ability to control or influence thoughts, feelings, behaviors of another person or group. Okay, so having high status often gives us power, but status and power are 2 separate and different things. Okay, status is the importance of our position, whereas power is our ability to control or influence. Okay, there's those 6 particular types of power that we talked about. So remember, reward power is about the ability to give positive consequences in response to receiving a behavior that you want. Coercive power, you can take those positive consequences away or give negative consequences instead to make someone do something, i.e., I'm going to give you girls a PBR if you don't listen to this lecture. Okay, that would be coercive power, because I can give you a negative consequence if you don't listen to the lecture. I'm not actually going to do that, because if you're listening to the lecture already to hear me say that, obviously you're listening to the lecture, so that's fine. 3, legitimate power. So here we're talking about the actual position of authority that somebody holds. Okay, so actually having legitimate authority, like a policeman, like a teacher, like a politician, gives somebody legitimate power to be able to do certain things. Okay, so a politician is elected, they have a specific position, that gives them the ability to control and influence the production of laws and creation of laws through our parliament. Referent power is that power that refers to the fact that we want to be liked by others. Okay, so if we want to be liked by somebody, we might do things in order that they like us back. Expert power is for situations where others can do things that we can't do. So for example, if your computer were to break down and you don't know how to fix it, realistically, you're not going to turn to the random person next to you and ask them to fix it for you. You're not going to try and fix it yourself. You're probably going to head down to the CCC and ask the techs down there what needs to be done. Okay, because they're experts, they understand computers, they know what's going to go on with it, they can probably take it and fix it for you. Informational power is a little bit different in the sense that it refers to an individual having resources or information that you can't otherwise access anywhere else. Okay, so someone who can give you information on how to do something has informational power, or someone who can share information about a particular event has informational power. If, for example, there's a big story going around about something that happened at the latest football match, there was a particular incident that occurred, and you haven't been able to locate a recording of that incident, but you have a friend who went to that game, they have informational power in terms of giving you details on what occurred. Okay? And you're going to listen to them because they're telling you what happened. You don't otherwise know. So, in terms of how one of the studies that looked at this, obviously Zimbardo Stanford Prison Experiment is the famous one. As always, I've put their completion and revision of the flowchart, highly recommended. So, let's just think nice and quickly. Aim-wise, Zimbardo wanted to look at what the impact of assigning roles to people was on their behaviour. So, in his particular experiment, he either assigned the participants to the role of a prisoner or of a guard, mock prisoner, mock guard, and the dependent variable that he was measuring was their behaviour in that prison environment. Okay, so some useful things to know and to remember about the results of this experiment are the fact that it was due to last 2 weeks, but it was stopped after 6 days. The guards very quickly became quite authoritarian and verbally abusive. It depended on the guard, but there was one guard in particular that did that a lot. Okay, and the overall conclusion was that the behaviour of normal, well-educated men can be significantly affected when a role they're given involves considerable power and status. So this experiment, like with many of the other ones that we're looking at, tied very much back to what happened in Nazi Germany and why did it happen. Okay. In terms of limitations for this experiment, obviously we talked about in class the fact that Zimbardo was the prison superintendent. It was obviously conducted with a relatively small sample size, impossible really to conduct it with a large one, and the sample size was all young university educated men who were sort of first, second, third year university. Zimbardo was the prison superintendent, so obviously that meant he had conflicting roles, which meant that the no harm principle was much more easily breached because he wasn't following the particular researcher role that needs to be followed and keeping himself separate from the experiment. We also talked about the fact that withdrawal rights were arguably breached because whilst he didn't stop people from leaving, if they really said, "I want to leave, let me out," they were let out, and there were a number of prisoners released over those first few days. However, he implied quite strongly in some situations that it would be better for them not to leave and that they shouldn't leave, and they took him up on that. Whether it was inferred or explicit is irrelevant. The fact is that the prisoners thought that they couldn't leave because their withdrawal rights hadn't been made very clear to them. So moving on to the second one, let's look at obedience. Okay, so definition for obedience: it's compliance with an order that's issued by an authority figure or someone who has power over you. Importance here is that this order does have to be issued by an authority figure or someone who has power for the behaviour that you then show to be referred to as obedience. Okay, the authority figure and power is really important here. So Milgram's aim in his teacher-learner experiment was to investigate the level of obedience shown to an authority figure, even if that meant inflicting pain on another person. So as you'll recall, his independent variable had the authority figure present in the room and giving certain instructions at certain points, such as the experiment requires that you continue. Teacher, you must go on, and so forth. Later, Milgram did some different variations of this particular study where he had either the experimenter sitting in a different room or phoning instructions in, or to give instructions and then leave the room, or a variety of other differences as well. Dependent variable was the level of obedience as measured by the shock voltage administered. So remember, there was the shock board that ran all the way up to 450 volts at 15 volt intervals. Each and every time the learner gave an incorrect answer, the teacher had to give them a shock and increase the shock voltage by 15 volts for each incorrect answer. Okay, so in this initial seminal study, there were 40 participants. They were all male participants. They were from a range of different walks of life. There were professionals, there were labourers, unskilled, skilled workers, and so forth. Of the 40 participants, 26 of them, or 65%, went to the maximum 450 volts. So the conclusion that Milgram drew from that was that people will obey an authority figure even if it means harming others. Obviously, when we look at this experiment, withdrawal rights are clearly breached because the teachers, the participants, were told very clearly, you cannot leave this experiment, you can't leave, you must go on. They were told that very explicitly. So hence the no harm principle as well, and the role of the researcher are questionable too, because they weren't ensuring that psychological harm didn't come to the participants. Deception was also used, and debriefing did follow after that and after the experiment to make sure that participants did know that no harm came to the learner and that the learner was a confederate and so forth. But the withdrawal rights is the main issue here. Okay, third and final of the studies that we look at, conformity. Conformity is the convergence of individuals' thoughts, feelings, or behaviours towards social norms. Okay, the key difference between conformity and obedience is that whereas obedience is following orders from an authority figure, conformity is essentially our tendency to fit in with the group. Okay, so if we conform, we're changing our thoughts or our feelings or our behaviours to match with what the group thinks. Whereas with obedience, if we do a particular action, we're doing it because someone who has power over us has told us to do it. Okay, whereas in the group situation, it's not that the group individually each has power over us, it's that group pressure as a whole can influence us to do certain things. The independent variable was the responses of the confederates as to whether they were truthful or lying, whether they said, if B was actually the same length as the target line, if they said B, they were being truthful, or otherwise they may have said C, and in fact they were lying and pretending. So the dependent variable was then the conformity that participants showed as measured by their responses. So if they agreed with the group when the group was lying, they were showing conformity. If they actually said what they truly saw and ignored the group, then they weren't showing conformity. Results-wise, remember, 75% of all participants conformed at least once. That's 3/4 conformed once, at least. And 37%, or a little over a third, of all responses showed conformity. That's overall, summing all the responses together. So, Ash concluded that reasonably intelligent and well-meaning young people are willing to call white black, which he thought was a cause for concern, because realistically it shows that we can be pressured by a group into believing certain things and doing certain things. Deception and debriefing was used in Ash's conformity experiments, so you can say that informed consent wasn't truly given, because you can't truly consent in an informed manner to something where you've been told you're doing something else. Okay? Obviously there are areas where deception can be used validly, but there are arguments as to whether or not in these conformity studies, whether it's A, possible to do an experiment without deception, and B, if that's the case, should we actually deceive? You can also argue that the no harm principle was possibly breached because psychological harm could potentially come to individuals from feeling that, oh gosh, I've got to give a particular answer, they're in a stressful social situation, and so forth. Alright, that's part 1 of this revision PowerPoint done. Please look below for part 2, which will continue with factors affecting conformity.